Your time, Tobias.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on once again.
Yes, thank you. So I guess let's start with Metallica's Blacklist. Ghost covered Enter Sandman, as we've discussed on the show. I keep wondering how such a massive project like that managed to be kept under wraps, something you know a little bit about. Like, did you have to sneak around to some extent to get this done? How did it not leak with so many musicians contributing?
I would say that Metallica camp is very professional, and just because of their stature, and I think that they're very savvy when it comes to professionalism, which I think was aided by a lot of these other artists being asked to participate. It was aided by their will to make it perfect. Usually leaks and people ruining things like that is usually because of people wanting to just destroy things, and I don't think that there was a will here to do that, which is but considering all the amount of people involved, it's an amazing achievement.
Quite the accomplishment.
I mean, just that.
Yeah,
yes,
for sure. Has there been a cover on Blacklist that caught your ear, and if so, who was it done by, and what made it stand out for you?
Oh, I haven't really spent a whole lot of time with each track. So, I mean, just listening through, that was alone like far beyond my sort of the time frame and my, what do you call it, like attention span. But I heard a lot of good things in there that was interesting. And I mean, obviously, just the variety of artists on there was very original, I think. I'd say that there were bits and pieces all over the place that I found really good, but I haven't spent enough time with each track listening to it over like several times to be like completely shining onto one special thing that sort of stuck out like that.
Volbeat are a Danish band, Ghost is a Swedish band. Do you feel a certain connection to them because of that? I mean, there's obviously like proximity and some similarities in language, but beyond that, just kind of like they are the one popular Danish band on rock radio. You are the one, so do you feel connected to them on some other level because of that?
Oh, of course. I mean, there is as far as being influenced by a lot of the old bands, obviously like Metallica or Maiden and all the bands that we played with have had the luxury of being, opening up for, like Guns N' Roses as well, Foo Fighters and Alice in Chains, and like all these bands. Of course, they would be influential and also like role models. I attribute a lot of like the school of rock that I learned from even before we got the opportunity to tour with them. I attribute that a lot to Metallica and Iron Maiden, just because of how they did things in the past and how they worked, how much they toured, where they played and all that. But one thing that is slightly amiss when you compare yourself to all these older bands is that they come from another time. Things were done differently there. They come from a completely different background. Not necessarily musically, but just environmentally it was just different. They were pioneers in so many ways. So whereas when it comes to, we're not competing with others, but when it comes to matching up with others, it's easier to look to a band like Volbeat or Five Finger Death Punch or Sabaton or bands like that, because we're close in age. Also close in age personally. We come from similar backgrounds. Me and Michael have both Michael in Volbeat, we have both played in death metal bands before we started playing rock music. So Volbeat was his second band, and that is my Ghost is also my third band. They obviously have a few years before us. They were touring before us, but we're definitely closer in age than we are with AC/DC. So,
yeah.
Of course, they are more, I feel, closer to them in terms of that. And obviously them being Danish, of course, means a lot. And I don't know if it makes sense. I mean, it's just we've been around for some time as well, but I always feel like a new band. I always feel like an amateur in that way, or like no amateur. I would say debutante. I always feel like debutante-ish, just because we came out in the 2000s. Because every other band is like 30 years old or 40 years old, and we're sort of new.
Get that. I've been in rock radio for a long time and still talk about a lot of the same bands. All right, we have way more with Tobias Forge this evening, and I've been trying to get to the bottom of this question for a minute now. There's been a lot of musicians who have spoken to me about how rewarding it was to actually get off the road for an extended period of time due to COVID and just get in that family time. And I know that you felt that way after being on tour for nearly a decade. But I keep wondering, like, yeah, of course we all love to spend time with our families. It's vital. It feeds our soul. So why is it that bands take on such demanding touring schedules? And did this pause change your perspective as a musician? Like, I feel like musicians need more of a balance. I don't know that people understand they spend the majority of their life away from loved ones just traveling. Doesn't seem right.
I think that there are a few factors, a few powers that comes to play and that determines a few of these things. And this is I'm trying not to be too business about this, but I think that and definitely not throwing anyone under the bus here, but I think that what bands are struggling with, and I know this because not only am I myself in a band or in a project like this, but I also have a lot of friends who are in bands that have kind of different formations and different setups, and there's not always a perfect alignment between what one guy in the band and the rest wants to do. It's not uncommon that you have someone in the band that might be a little bit more creatively occupied and writes more music than others, sort of spends more energy on creating things, wanting to maybe play a little bit less, whereas you have the people in the band who might not be that creative, but they depend on the paycheck, who wants the band to play more. And that is a very common thing. There's nothing wrong with that. That's how it usually is. And I think that once you've taken the step of not doing your band as a hobby, which is actually most people who are in successful bands, and I'm saying successful as in that doesn't mean that turn you into that band that turns you into a millionaire. I'm talking about a band that is relatively known and you can play shows everywhere. There's a ton of death metal bands that could do that, but most of them were hobby bands. Most bands around nowadays, just because of live shows being so, obviously disregard the COVID thing, but in modern time, there are a lot of bands that at some point or another have had to make the choice. Are we a hobby band or are we a real band, like touring? And usually that sets bands apart pretty quickly, because once you've burnt the boat of having a daytime job, you're depending on like money coming in, like, and that sort of sets off this sort of cyclic lifestyle where you make a record, then you tour, and most bands touring know the drill. It's like European festivals in June and July, and then you do America there, and then you usually go to Australia there, and then you go there then, and then there's like the April-May tour in the US, and it's very, very similar. Most bands do that sort of very predictably, and some people love it. Some people do not.
About touring and how grueling it is, and how Ghosts have been on the road for over a decade pretty solidly, and how COVID has forced musicians to be home, and how grateful they were to have that time with family and friends. And you were talking about how some people love the road, others not so much. I was wondering where you stand on that.
If I'm just speaking from my end, I've always to some degree lived a somewhat transient lifestyle. And I'm talking even back to the fact, that going back to where, I had divorced parents. So it's like I was naturally sort of sort of seeing a week-to-week sort of basis, and I had to travel and I had to go away, come home, go away, come home. And then when I started having friends, when you get to that age where you start spending nights over at friends' houses, I found myself living out on couches for years. And when I started touring, it felt very natural to be on tour. Like it's almost like having sea legs if you're a sailor or a pirate or something. If you're touring, if you like touring, that it's hard not to like being moving all the time. And because I'm also the creative force within this band, and I am essentially the only one that is expected, as much as I'm collaborating with people on all sorts of things, like I don't paint our covers, I don't print our shirts, but I am the only one that is expected to produce anything. So I have a ton to do all the time, even in COVID times, even a year off. It's like I can do things all the time. There's always things to do. So for me, creatively, I always see things that are half done or potentially done or that could potentially be done. And then I have this huge to-do list of things that we haven't achieved yet. So for me, it's always just a constant looking forward to new things and like looking at dates and looking at that I for the last 10 years at least, I've constantly written the wrong year. If I have to sign something with a date today, I would write like 2022. Oh, wait, maybe no, it's 2021. Oh, yeah, because I'm looking at 2022 and 2023, 2024 even. Whereas if you're in the band and you might sort of just be playing, of course, a lot of that is not part of your world. You're not part of the creative bit, and then it becomes more important those hours on stage to perform, or if that might not be the thing that you burn for, maybe it becomes just a problem because you have to leave home, because you have to do this, and maybe that grows discontent. And that happens in all bands, and that's usually when it gets messy. But it's very natural. It's not hard to understand the mechanics of that.
Some Loudwire Nights this evening. He's been our guest all hour long, and I know that when I've seen Ghost live, we see the Papa costumes. Those are usually traveling along with the band. What happens with the Nameless Ghouls costumes? What do you do with those?
We do have all the retired Papas ends up, on display that we bring on tour. I mean, basically because they're the more elaborate suits, and therefore obviously the most costly ones, and they need to be handled a certain way. But also because a lot of the Papa get-ups, because of the nature of how they're made and how you wear them, they aren't as subjected to wear and tear that a lot of the ghoul costumes are. We have toyed with the idea of what to do with all the ghoul costumes, but the problem is that out of all of them that we've made over the years, so many of them are destroyed because they are used to death and they fall apart basically. And over the years, we've also had to redo many of them because in between tours, and this is like the disgusting part, but it wasn't uncommon. We are better now because we have people taking care of everything, and we try to make them or have them made in materials, and that doesn't lead to this. But I mean, there's been moments when you open up a wardrobe beginning of a tour, like the day before tour starting and everything arrives at whatever venue they were starting the tour at, and opening up a big wardrobe case that has been, slow boated over 6 weeks from some country somewhere. And what you open up is just mold. It's molded, like completely destroyed because people, has worn it and it's been packed up in a warm 30 degrees Celsius sort of environment, and then it's been put through long travels, and so a lot of it is actually destroyed, unfortunately.
Ghost here on Loudwire Nights, and life is funny, right? When you were young, really young, in Sweden, Halloween was not a thing. it was your generation that really started it over there. And now you have a song in the movie, Halloween Kills. So given all of that, I wonder what your earliest Halloween memory is of like actually dressing up and doing it American style.
As a kid, I dressed up a lot. So, but the first time I dressed up for a Halloween party must have been, I don't remember exactly when this was. I think it was it must have been later part of the 90s. 96 or 97, something like that. Because before that, Halloween was not a thing here. So it was something that younger people in the 90s sort of arranged as a theme party, if that makes sense. It was more like a theme thing. And funnily enough, and maybe someone would contradict me saying like, no, I know exactly where to buy stuff like that, even back in 96 or 97. But my memory of it, that you couldn't buy like Halloween paraphernalia. I mean, unless you were talking about the band or if you were talking about the film. You had to make everything yourself. It was way more free form, whereas now is everything as commercial as in America, where you can buy like all the stuff everywhere. I love it. I'm not being like, oh, it's just a commercial holiday. It's one of the commercial holidays that I really love, that we here in Sweden and in Nordics and in Europe that we've embraced, because it's really cozy. It's really nice. I love it. To answer your question, it was late 90s when I was about 15, 16, something like that.
And what did you make? What did you wear?
Ironically, when I dress up, or when I've dressed up throughout my life, it hasn't been nearly as elaborate and well-made as I've done professionally. Probably just a skull in the face, sort of misfit style.
Quite surprising. Yeah, that is surprising. All right, here is Hunter's Moon Ghost on Loudwire Nights, all the rock that matters.
It's been a long time coming.